Hi, this is Laura Ciceri, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and I want to invite you to join our webinar today, Case Studies on Driving Digital Innovation. Our webinars are a monthly format where we invite practitioners to join us to give their insights on the research that we're doing. Today, I've invited Elizabeth Coggins-Hill to join me. She is a global materials manager at Smiths Detection. Elizabeth, welcome to the program.
Hello, Laura, and welcome to you too.
Yeah, so I met you through LinkedIn and had a great conversation with you at the Network of Networks. Can you share a little bit with the audience about yourself and your history in supply chain?
Yes, well, I've been in supply chain and continuous improvement for over 25 years. So, to give you an idea, I started way back when emails weren't even a thing for people in the office. So yes, that probably puts a bit of a date on me. I've held roles from anything from a commercial coordinator to the global materials manager at Smiths. In between, I've also done various regional roles. And though I'm British, I live and work in Germany. And I have a small bit of consulting on the side that I do as well.
And what does Smiths Detection do? What do you manufacture? Just to help the group.
Right. Smiths Detection makes X-ray machines, but they're not the kind of medical X-ray machines that most of you know from hospitals. They're more like the X-ray machines that if you've been through an airport and you've had to have your hand baggage X-rayed to see that there's nothing naughty in it, that's the kind of machine that we produce. If you actually go through the various airports in the world, you will most likely see a Smiths detection machine somewhere. There's also that, and there's the people scanners as well. They're not necessarily X-ray, though we do produce some. And on top of that, there's another thing which is more the chemical detection, which are if you've ever had your laptop swiped down at an airport and had the little piece of paper put into a magic little machine. That is the kind of machine and technology that Smiths makes as well. All in all, it's made for both for civil use, and then there's a bit that makes stuff for let's say military use as well, such as bomb detection and explosives detection. So that's kind of the range. It's part of the larger Smiths group, but it's a company in itself.
Well, great. As we go along, I'm going to ask for your insights because I think right now we are at a transition point in digital reality. The third industrial revolution, which Elizabeth, you and I were part of, which was computers and mobile phones. Productivity gains from that revolution stopped in 2004. And right now, people are trying to design the digital transformation, questioning what it means and what it looks like. And I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from the third industrial revolution to carry forward to the fourth. And so, there's a need because most of the industries are going backwards in inventory management. I did this analysis last week for LinkedIn. If you look at this, industries like the chemical, the A&D industry, the beverage industry, the beauty industry are going backwards, and only household products and automotive are going forwards. And you would think that some of that is because we're pushing inventory and cost downstream to the suppliers versus actually managing it ourselves. So, we're also going backwards in cost in most of the industries. This is orbit chart of food, right? So Elizabeth, don't you think it's funny that we can sit and talk that, we have best practices when we're actually not going forward in productivity, cost, and inventory? Don't you just think that's ironic?
It's completely ironic. Now, before I joined Smiths, I was part of the automotive supply chain. In fact, I worked for a tier one manufacturer, GK and Driveline. And what we observed is whilst as quite on the previous slide where you had automotive dropping down their inventory days and saying, aren't we great? What we saw at tier 1 level, down to almost tier 3, was an increase in inventories, mainly because most of that was pushed back through wonderful kind of schemes that the automotive industry came up with, like just in sequence. Well, you try doing just in sequence over 4,000 kilometers and tell me that, quite honestly, this automotive parts manufacturer ends up dumping the stuff on the doorstep and holding that inventory for the automotive company. So yeah, your figures, my experience, bear out your figures, sadly. So yes, we are in a very strange position at the moment, certainly as far as the uncertainty is concerned, certainly as far as we're waiting for the next big thing. We're in a bit of a VHS and Betamax moment, I reckon.
Yeah, and so if you think, Elizabeth, you and I are, similar in that, we experienced the rise of computers and mobile phones. And what do you think we can learn from that third industrial revolution and the evolution of supply chain practices over the last 2 decades that we can carry forward as we think about the digital transformation we're going to talk through today?
Right. What we can learn from the third is that there's no such thing as stability. That the speed of change, as we all know, is increasing, which means that quite frequently it's more the technical skills that get asked, and that you need to keep on top of. What do we need? Next thing is investment. And this is something that supply chain historically has been a bit of a Cinderella department for an awful lot of companies. And it took them a very long time to figure out that actually supply chain is where an awful lot of the money sits. So what can we learn out of the third there is actually to shout loud and push for a place at the table when they're actually making decisions about what the structure of a company is going to be, what the structure of their supply chain is going to be. Really push that, because if we don't push it, basically the companies will fail. It's a level of investment that is required. It is a mental change. It's also keeping fit and keeping nimble on your feet, as far as and in your brain, as to being open to these changes that are coming our way, and not to be scared, because there's opportunity everywhere.
Well, I'm seeing a transformation in the landscape. I'm talking to hospitals that are talking about Amazon as the new partner. And as I walk down the streets of Philadelphia, yesterday, 2 retailers closed their doors, and one manufacturer that I'm working with is going bankrupt. And, part of, I think, driving a digital transformation is being naturally curious, don't accept the status quo, and really push for change. And so the first step in driving the digital transformation, and we're going to go through some basic definitions before we get to the case studies, is ask yourself the question every time you hear the word digital supply chain, what does a company mean by that? There is no one definition. I define the digital supply chain as transforming the atoms and electrons of the supply chain through the confluence of new technologies, which can be blockchain, streaming data, Internet of Things, 3D printing, often called additive manufacturing, robotics, wearables and mobility, cognitive computing. And in the center, there's a real push on open source analytics, Hadoop, Kafka, Apache Spark. We're finding that open source analytics are typically about 1/5 the cost of relational analytics with relational databases like Oracle and SAP and IBM. And the open source allows us to be able to manage unstructured and structured data. So unstructured data could be pictures, it could be warranty text, it could be customer service sentiment text, it could be contracts. And if you think about the world of supply chain, we've been very focused on structured data, and we have wanted pristine structured data, which is really kind of a waste of time as we look at machine learning and schema on read type of applications. So people will often say to me, well, Laura, what do you mean by transforming the atoms of the supply chain? Well, I was visiting Jabil the other day, and they were showing me the thinking of their additive manufacturing pilots, where they transform their processes to not think about the development of parts through the traditional machining, but to really think about additive manufacturing. And it's really a great display if you're at Jabil to look at, because it showed how different the paradigm was of additive manufacturing. Could we print medical devices in the operating room? Can we 3D print human organs? Can we 3D print small items in a retail store? Can we 3D print spare parts? Can we 3D print an automotive, a dashboard in real time? So the concept of 3D printing is a way to think about atoms. In addition, if we look at fermentation and the evolution of processes to really transform waste, I've been working with a number of companies that are working on solar-powered fermentation on waste streams of all different sorts, where we can do custom molecules and chemical processing. Or if we look at the collaborative economy, where we have shared atoms. So instead of selling cars, we have sharing of cars. Instead of selling of medical supplies, we have shared cabinets for medical supplies. We move from selling products to selling services, which is a transformation of the supply chain. When we think about Internet of Things, our conventional systems are very much about static data, latent data, data that doesn't move at the speed of business. And so as we think about streaming data architectures, here we are looking at how do we take sensors and telematics and GPS signals and the world of signals and streaming data and move that data for intelligence. Now, Elizabeth, I know you're working with us on the blockchain and the network of networks, and one of the things that I find really exciting about blockchain is the transformation of B2B to potentially eliminate EDI and to combine documents like contracts with transactional information or specifications with lineage information. So the ability to append the contracts with the transactional data and to be able to track across an immutable ledger. And cognitive computing allows us to sense, learn, and act. So instead of looking at exceptions, the systems will tell us the exceptions that they need us to fix. And wearables and mobility enable us to enable the worker. With one of the case studies we're going to talk about today is AGCO, that went from using tablets, because tablets were all breaking, to putting wearables on manufacturing lines and operators to combine with Internet of Things data to be able to better improve quality and assembly on their machine lines, and then robotics. So it's the confluence of this, along with open source analytics, that I think makes many of the traditional approaches, like an tightly integrated ERP, obsolete, or traditional supply chain planning more obsolete, and really looks at the transformation to not just digitize the supply chain, but drive digital transformation. So digitization gets the data into a digital form. Digital supply chain actually is the questioning of what are the atoms and what should be the electrons of the supply chain through the confluence of technologies. So Elizabeth, as you look at this, what excites you here? Where do you think the greatest opportunity is going to come from?
Right. This is, all of it excites me, but there are certain elements that really stand out for me. One, blockchain. It has immense potential, but as you said, it's still a bit in its infancy as far as how we can use it. Quite honestly, storing of contracts on the blockchain rather in drawers. We pay a lot of money for lawyers to sort out these contracts, but then they get stuck away in a drawer somewhere and never ever are they touched ever again. That will be one thing, so that it actually becomes when you're negotiating a contract, you're actually focusing on what the end result is rather than trying to get the best deal. There is a difference between the two, because on a blockchain contract, it's kind of where are the gateposts, the gateways for each of the steps of contract fulfillment. Another thing that I'm looking to the blockchain for, and is getting rid of letters of credit. Now, letters of credit, I don't know how many people in the audience actually have ever sat down and had to do one of these. Well, in my first job, I had to. And these are vastly paper-driven monsters issued by banks to act as an escrow service between the buyer and the seller. Now, the sooner we can move that onto the blockchain, the happier I will be, because they are still used today, particularly where large sums of money are involved. And let's put it like this: machinery purchases in a number of companies that I've come in touch with are still made using letters of credit. What else excites me? Well, obviously the cloud sharing, the sharing of data. Ever since I got into supply chain, it's like, well, wouldn't it be great if everybody actually could see the information? Well, blockchain's one of it. Cloud sharing, where we can all actually access the data and get remote teams working together, and also co-opetition. So working with in collaboration with your competitors, all possible through this wonderful thing called cloud sharing. 3D printing, well, yeah, that can't come sooner enough either. So from nano size stuff right up to house size. I mean, my husband's in the building industry, and we've been looking at these printing houses, and it's just like, wow. So there's so much opportunity there. I'm part of Cranfield University's Manufacturing 2075 group, and we were looking at things like lunar printing, printing using lunar materials on the moon to create a base. Those are kind of, I mean, that's way out there. Scheme on read, that's the other big one, because I can't wait for the death of structured data, because all my life has been plagued with cleaning up data before I can actually analyze it. So those are, if I had to pick out, those are some of the ones that really, really kind of do it for me.
Well, and I think it's important that we learn from the past to unlearn, to relearn. And I think the tough thing is unlearning. I'm working with a company that's working on digital supply chain transformation. And the first thing they did was they did a contract with a large consulting company to clean up master data. And I'm like, if we're driving a digital supply chain transformation, we have the opportunity to use cognitive computing and machine learning so that our master data problems of yesterday are no longer a constraint. But yet that company is spending, multi-millions of dollars to clean up master data and transactional systems that really does not have to happen because they can't unlearn. I'm working with another company that is on a 10-year ERP rollout, and instead of stabilizing ERP and innovating at the edge to bring it back into the core, they're going to continue on this evolution and migrate to the next evolution of relational databases. And I'm like, I think we need to stabilize ERP investment and get on with the digital supply chain. But with that, Elizabeth, let's look at some case studies and see what other people are actually driving. So, as we talk about the fact that we no longer need to be encumbered by stuffing data in rows and columns and, thinking only about linear flows through ERP or fixed hierarchies, because now we're going to look at schema on read. And I think it's important that we just take a minute and talk about the difference between schema on read and schema on write. Traditional applications have focused on fixed hierarchies, and so when you implement a solution, you have to know, what the relationship is, and as the business changes, you've got to go back in and you've got to rebuild the hierarchies. Well, schema on read basically looks at the data joins and looks at the data formats in a data lake and will basically give you a hierarchical representation, if you so desire, when you read the data, which is a major transformation and gets us into much more flexible architectures. And then the movement to descriptive and predictive analytics to cognitive and prescriptive analytics that allow us to sense, learn, and act. And so just to be clear for the audience, as we talk about open source lingo, these are some of the terms that become very important. Kafka, which allows us to deal with time phase data, Spark, which is very focused on streaming data. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about Apache Spark. Ignite, which is for in-memory computing, Gamuda, which is for workflow, TensorFlow, machine learning, general analytics through Hadoop. These concepts are so important that I encourage people to think about their analytics architectures of what should move through clouds so that we can share data more readily, what should move through streams, and what should move through pools so that we can have the analytics group start to work on new forms of analytics, not with our traditional applications like SRM, CRM, ERP, APS, PLM, which I call alphabet soup analytics, but instead to put analytics at the core between our transactional systems and workforce productivity to define through open source analytics where data should pull, where it should stream, and where it should flow, and to think hard about cloud streams and pools in the architecture and the movement to prescriptive and cognitive analytics. And so, Google probably has done the best job of bringing us a case study of prescriptive analytics, which we're driving down the road and we see that there's a traffic accident ahead of us, and in real time it gives us an alternative. That is prescriptive analytics. Cognitive analytics allows us to sense, learn, and act and to drive the answer across the organization. So I envision that we're just a couple of years from having a rules-based ontology that goes across the network and allows us to have prescriptive and cognitive analytics at each node in an open source analytics framework. And let's take our first case study. So this is Lennox International. Lennox International makes heating, air conditioning systems. And, in the words of the supply chain leader, they always failed with the first hot day and the first cold day because they could never really have spare parts that were available because they just couldn't predict it. And so they went from a very generalized map of a region, which this is the United States on the side, and they had spare parts, 1.5 million locations, and they were looking at weather maps at a very high level. And then they moved to looking at climates and being able to look at, how the climates were changing. But more importantly, what they did was they redefined their units. So each of their heating air conditioning unit now has a sensor associated with it and streaming data that basically shares in a real time how is that heating air conditioning unit performing for each of the homeowners. And that streaming data, along with the climate data, is coming in and giving a recognition to a dealer that says that that heating air conditioning unit is performing as planned, or there are these deviations. And then that is then processed by a distributor that says, you've got a problem and potentially you would want to have your unit serviced. So this is very different than traditional service where you make an appointment, a person comes to your house, they're usually late, and, you think you need part X and you really need part Y. And it's really prescriptive analytics on streaming data to redefine service. And the other thing they're looking at is perhaps 3D printing in the field and redefining service. There's an awful lot I think we can do when we focus on allowing sensors to give us status and redefining service. The other thing is, if we look at replenishment, the Internet of Things can help us with replenishment. I often laugh when I go into the local McDonald's and I see, the Coca-Cola machines, because I remember talking to Coca-Cola about the opportunity to include Internet of Things capabilities to not only see what needed to be replenished with syrups, but also to get demand insights about how people were combining syrups to look at localized assortment. But they didn't do that. Instead, these machines are relatively dumb and they don't talk to the supply chain. But there is actually in your neck of the woods, Elizabeth, Costa Express, and they have implemented the Internet of Things for real-time replenishment on their coffee machines. So every time that you get a cup of coffee with Costa Express, it sends a signal that says that, I got a latte, I got a cappuccino, and drives replenishment through the speed of, business for replenishment. Another Internet of Things case study based upon open source analytics that I'm working with is the use of AIS sensors in mobile devices to be able to look at container locations. And these container locations are actually helping with improved on-time delivery. What we're finding is that the ETA, or the estimated time of delivery, is usually off by 9 hours. And that is because we're dealing with a theoretical on-time delivery versus an actual based upon sensor information. So those are 3 case studies of the Internet of Things. So Elizabeth, what speaks to you there?
Wow. Certainly the service element. I'm like any other homeowner. I expect when the service engineer turns up that they've got the right part. And it will be so much easier if certain parts of the household equipment would actually speak to the companies that made them. So that's one area that is definitely really very interesting. In Smiths, there are tentative steps being made to do this with the machines, I've been told. What also speaks to me is the visibility, making the supply chain visible. Now, ever since I did my master's, and that was, giving away my age, that was in the early 2000s, and we've been talking about making the supply chain visible. And this is where having a combination of the Internet of Things with also the delivery services around them. The local printing of parts, I think technologically at the moment is a bit tricky, but I do believe that is coming as well. So looking at your 3 case studies there, yes, Coca-Cola missed a trick. Yes, Costa have more or less got it right, except for the price. What they also do is they take your loyalty card, by the way, and you shove that into the machine and they get a profile of me and what coffees I like to drink, which is also quite handy because they've made their machines intelligent. And I think that this is a way that the supply chain has to really start looking, rather than looking from the inside of we make stuff and we ship stuff and we get stuff in to make stuff. We actually really need to, rather than changing from inside out, we really need to have a look at what's out there and then start applying some of this stuff and do an outside in change. And I know you're a fan of that one, Laura. I mean, you've been talking about it for a great long while, that the change, because the change is so fundamental. The mindset change that has to happen here is one that there's so much out there. Let's really have a look, as you say, at the atoms of the supply chain and rebuild the supply chain. So yeah, those are the elements that speak to me, particularly the communication bit. That's absolutely, I'm all for supply chain transparency.
Right, and so when we think about, many times people will say, well, I'm building an end-to-end supply chain, and I say, well, where does it start and where does it end? And most people say, well, it starts at my front door and ends at my back door. And I'm like, it really needs to start in the markets, right, outside in. And it needs to really orchestrate across suppliers. And they look at me because they've got, a very functional view of supply chain and a very limited view. But When I'm talking about outside in, I'm starting with the market. I'm starting with market signals. I'm starting with, in the case of Linux, they're looking at climate change and they're looking at sensors and aggregate analytics of the sensors to be able to redefine business models. So let's talk about digital manufacturing. So digital manufacturing, I think, is a great opportunity for us to add the combination of additive manufacturing with paperless products and wearables and robotics. And one of my favorite case studies, which is available on our website and our Global Summit, is the work at AGCO. AGCO makes large equipment for farmers, customized equipment. And what happened was AGCO had basically outfitted their workers with durable tablets. And as the workers climbed on and off of the equipment, these tablets would break, and they were not inexpensive. They were $4,000 and $5,000. So what they did was they said, how can we combine the Internet of Things with wearables and be able to basically take an Internet of Things wrench and what's happening on the sensors on the equipment along with wearables. And they outfitted their employees with glasses. You can see on the bottom here all their employees wearing safety glasses, which are really smart glasses that allow paperless processes. So it's a combination of barcoding, Internet of Things tools, the sensors on the equipment, and the use of watches to be able to have paperless processes. And the results are really pretty incredible in terms of the turnarounds of getting the equipment to customers and improving quality. And a lot of it comes down to paper. It's the ability for a worker to get to paper, to write on paper. It's just not natural in many of our processes to be able to source and use paper. So digital manufacturing here is a combination of Internet of Things, wearables, and looking at sensors. Also, I'm working with companies that are redefining digital manufacturing to redefine downtime and maintenance through sensing off of equipment. So instead of taking equipment down based upon mean time failure, looking at the sensors on the equipment to be able to look at when should they take the equipment down and how do they track and trace equipment flows in real time to be able to understand is manufacturing on what they call the happy trail, right, where I'm not seeing the friction on the motors or the issues with the equipment, and I'm seeing high quality of conformance of the equipment. So we've got an awful lot of sensors in manufacturing that just aren't used, and we have the opportunity now through new technologies to redefine manufacturing. Elizabeth, thoughts there?
First of all, if I could get rid of paper off any shop floor. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I went to a wonderful, wonderful company that has a brilliant product, except for the fact that on the shop floor, the entire life of the product through the factory and through testing is noted on a piece of paper. Then it's manually put into the system, but that piece of paper carries on all the way with it was most bizarre. It was most bizarre. And also in other, I mean, I know it from automotive. It took a while to move away from the paper document or the run sheet that was on the side of the bin in our case, because we were using metal parts. They had a run sheet on the side of what should happen to these parts. So moving away from that is always a good thing, because it also cuts down on risk of mix-ups. You know, if bins have hangers on them and they have pieces of paper and the hangers fall off, or one of the pieces of paper falls off, and you either don't notice it's fallen off, or you do notice and it's fallen off two bins simultaneously, which bin do you stick it on? That's a good question. That really is. And I've seen that in the past. So that area, the safety, actually, the wearables is also a lot about health and safety. Now, I've been fortunate enough to travel all over the world in my job, and I've seen sometimes exceedingly risky behavior simply because somebody had to get somewhere to read a number and note it down. So yes, being able to sense things from, let's say, remotely, anything from RFID tagging through, there's other stuff out there that will be, or smart pallets, absolutely, inside the factory, great. The additive manufacturing, well, there is a bit of GKN that does do that as part of the powder metallurgy branch. So, and they're really quite in with the car manufacturers on that particular front. That is a growth sector for them. So you start seeing it, but I'd also like to see it, jokingly enough, down the dentist down the road, because at the moment, if you want to have a crown done for your tooth, what do? You have a mold done, that's sent away, and then eventually, somewhere like 3 weeks later, you get an invitation to go back to your dentist, which is not necessarily a favorite place in the world. So all those kind of things, if we start thinking about how we make stuff, there's some stuff that you will not be able to transform, but I think for about 95% of what we make at the moment, there's a better way to do it.
Yeah, I think particularly when we're dealing with low volume manufacturing. Well, Elizabeth, let's now turn to the network of networks, because one of the issues is that we connect through trading partners primarily through EDI, and EDI is like getting an old-fashioned envelope in the mail with a stamp on it. You know, it's not bidirectional. When we get it, it's often old. And so one of the things that we're working on through the Network of Networks group, which Elizabeth attended the last one in Europe, which is in June of this year, and the one in North America is in April, and then we'll do another one in July. We're meeting quarterly in the two continents to be able to look at how can we redefine through distributed and open technologies an ecosystem of technology providers and business users to improve interoperability and value networks to really drive business outcomes. And one of the limitations we have is that many people think, well, you know, is my ERP to your ERP to their ERP, and, you know, transactional flows are, you know, a very small portion of what we need to be pushing through the systems. You know, we need specifications, we need contracts, we need payments, and we need to redefine multi-tier workflows. And we also need to be able to drive canonical integration through Alemica, connecting with GT Nexus, connecting with Ariba, connecting with EDA Open, connecting with private networks, to be able to combine the canonicals that are in the supply chain operating networks with cognitive computing to be able to help us with master data and many-to-many architectures, visualization and benchmarking, and cognitive learning to be able to drive interoperability. And we're testing open source analytics, cloud-based computing, along with blockchain and cognitive computing in test cases to be able to look at the redefinition of B2B. And we're very early. We've got 4 case studies. One of them is looking at invoicing in Europe, crossing borders, and how we can change payment to a 3PL in a purchase. One of them is looking in the United States about how we can get better delivery and logistics confirmation through logistics providers and manufacturers. One is focused on lineage and traceability, which is looking at blockchain and the ability to track specifications and approvals and corrections and acceptance of materials. And one is looking at supplier onboarding of how could we write information once through supplier information. We're working on the ISO standards of LEI and how we can have definitive authority on parts and also company so that we can write once and use many times to decrease onboarding. So community directory, traceability, supply chain finance, and interoperability are some of the targets that we're working on. Elizabeth, your thoughts here. What excites you?
Well, let's start off with the community directory. particularly the right once and use again and again and again. I don't know who in the audience has ever really run into head first into the compliance department at where you work, and it's like, this is the part numbering system for this. But then if we want to have a bit of a change, then it's a whole new brand new part numbering system. And where we're starting to look on the community directory thing, what really gets me excited there is the ability to do variants, but write once, use many times. That is definitely the traceability. Nobody likes buying stuff from dodgy parts of the world, and let's put it like this: being able to trace back the lineage of parts from a quality point of view, but also sometimes from a social responsibility point of view, is becoming more and more important for companies. The traceability, I can think back to one particular instance that I experienced in automotive, where if we had good traceability, then the problem may not have arisen in the first place. On the finance side, well, if we can get the banks out of the equation, or if the banks change their role in the equation, I suppose is probably a more politic way of doing things, saying things, that would be great. And of course, no, EDI, as you said, is so, it's one-to-one, and it's actually, although people, companies say, oh yeah, we have an onboarding procedure for our suppliers, we have an onboarding procedure for our customers, it's incredibly prescriptive, which and is quite often linked to EDI and the limitations therein. So yes, there's their interoperability. Yeah, well, okay, master data management standards. I go that with the community directory because parts of those actually abut quite nicely.
Well, and I'd encourage people to join us, because I think it takes supply chain leaders all around the world to try to change some of these paradigms. And, we are doing testing, and we've got our next meeting in Europe in June and our next meeting in the United States in April. It's open for everyone to join, and we're trying to move the world from the late adopter, where we're really looking at, traditional applications of transactional systems and, limited views of predictive analytics, to really try to drive more early adoption of cognitive computing, machine learning, blockchain, Internet of Things, wearables, drones, autonomous vehicles. And this year we'll be having our Supply Chain Insights Global Summit in Philadelphia, where we will be showcasing case studies on these concepts and really helping people to drive change. So, Elizabeth, let's wrap up. I think we got to embrace new technologies at the right time. The early adopters will drive the first innovation, and then we've got to learn and then really challenge our traditional paradigms and build with the goal in mind. I don't think this can just be science projects. And then remember that the supply chain is a complex, nonlinear system where we've got a lot of interoperability. So we've got to get out of our functional silos and drive outside in. It reminds me, Elizabeth, you're younger than I am, but, I was, graduated from college in '78, and my first job, we didn't have computers and we didn't have mobile phones. And I came to the office and got an index card and hand wrote all of my memos. And, the first personal computer actually took 2 people to roll down the hallway, and we signed up for, 1-hour slots. And I never conceived the third industrial revolution. And I'm thinking about, as I said in that cubicle then, and I was kind of skeptical about the role of computers and mobile phones and how they would change our lives. I could never conceive that, I could have ordered my groceries from Peapod sitting in the Frankfurt airport last week, on an app in my phone, or that, I could, look visually at, what was happening in Philadelphia in the snowstorm from my Paris hotel. But so much has changed, but so much has not changed. what is your advice for someone listening to this call about how to move to the fourth industrial revolution?
I think the first big thing is around comfort zones. We all love our comfort zones, but we know that this is happening, and it's get out there, be curious, get in touch with your local. I mean, here I'm just outside Frankfurt, so there's a fintech community in Frankfurt. Find out where your local people are meeting, and first of all, get out there, get involved. Don't be afraid to be, when you sometimes feel, the stupidest person in the room. Boy, have I felt that a number of times in my career. And what you actually end up doing is asking the questions that everybody else is kind of too shy to ask. And at the same time, you're learning something, but you're also developing yourself and pushing your boundaries. Supply chain is not a place where you is certainly not a profession where you can sit back and be comfortable. If you're sitting back and being comfortable, then you're in the wrong role, because supply chain has always been and will always be at the forefront of getting stuff done. It sounds awful, getting stuff done, but it is. And if I was starting out today, now bearing in mind this is coming from somebody who studied economics but almost got kicked from university because she spent too much time with the tech guys on the computers. So give you an idea, be curious about the new thing, but also don't succumb to the fear of missing out. You only have so many hours a day. Ration them, use them wisely, look after yourself and your health, but certainly there's too much. Decide what you want to look at and then target on that for a period of time, and then keep growing from that particular point of view. If it turns out it's something that you think down the road, well, maybe not, well, at least you've learnt something and you know what won't suit you. I've done that a number of times where I've gone down the road and thought, maybe not. So it's about developing yourself. It's your journey. It's nobody else's journey. So just develop yourself, stay curious, and regardless what they say, age is just a number.
Well, I think that we have the opportunity to take a different path if we're curious and we, challenge the existing paradigms. I'm going to close now. We had a hard time putting on this webinar. It's a digital webinar in an analog world, and last week we were prepared to do it, but we had some issues with the snowstorm and the east coast of the U.S., so, it was hard to put on a digital webinar in an analog world. Elizabeth, I appreciate your flexibility. We will continue to write on case studies on digital supply chain transformation, providing webinars monthly, facilitating the share groups for cognitive computing and network of networks. If you're interested, please reach out. And also, please join us for our Supply Chain Insights Global Summit that will be happening in Philadelphia in September. If you can't get the funds to come, we will live cast it free for people around the world globally, and we will be networking on Twitter and LinkedIn about the concepts, and then we'll archive all the case studies. It's our goal that we can think differently and drive new outcomes. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for asking me, Laura.
Until next time. Bye now.
Bye.